Obviously, the Canadian economy is going through a fundamental transformation. Canadians understand the complexity and volatility that we're seeing in the world economy, but I've always said that I am very confident in the Canadian economy and Canadian workers, Canadian industry.
Canada now in a technical recession. Is the government making the right moves on the economy? And how is Ottawa responding to those current challenges? The recession is one example. Job numbers, though, looked pretty good on Friday. Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum. Stephanie Levitz is a senior reporter in the Globe and Mail's Parliament Hill Bureau in Ottawa. Charelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times in Ottawa. And Rob Shaw, a political correspondent for CHEK News. And he's in Victoria today. Nice to see everybody. I did that interview with Francis Donald and then just sort of calmed down a lot because it did seem this week as though this whole narrative around a recession that the Conservatives were pushing very hard was starting to take hold. There was a little bit of good news on Friday with those job numbers. But Steph Levitz, tell me what you think the state of the economy tells us about how the government is managing, I guess, a little bit expectations from Canadians.
I think the state of the economy is a personalized thing for Canadians, right? I think you can look at words like technical recession, and depending on what your life looks like, what about your mortgage payments? What about your grocery bills? What about your job future? Did your kid find a job this summer or not? And that affects how you actually view the economy, right? And so there are things like, if you look at the price of groceries, you have, if you're buying coffee, if you're buying beef, if you're buying fresh produce, you've seen those prices for those products go up markedly over the last 7 months or several months. And you're thinking, oh God, the economy, like this is terrible. If you're buying milk, just as an example, that price has remained steady now for months. So it's really about how people are feeling, and where politicians often use this economic data is to get people in the fields, right?
Yeah.
So perhaps it's, I don't know, I want to say luck or by design that on Friday was the Liberals' big groceries and essentials benefit kicked in, right? That multi-billion-dollar program that they announced to deal specifically with inflationary food prices. That comes on the heels of, the data from StatsCan saying technical recession. So maybe people who were feeling a little bit of that now feel it a little bit less. And conversely, the Conservatives, who see Mark Carney's economic bona fides as like the thing that they will ultimately win out over. I don't know if that's true at the ballot box, the thing they'll be able to challenge. They can seize on the data and say, see, he's not doing anything at all. And they can argue, rightfully or wrongfully, he's making it better or worse.
Those are all excellent points. And Charelle, I think that it was curious to me that the Conservatives took on sort of the macro picture of the economy rather than talking about the affordability issue, because as Steph rightly points out, that is the issue that people are still grappling with, regardless of recession or not recession. What did you make of how the Conservatives took that on and the way the government responded?
Well, what went through my mind when I was hearing, the push about technical recession, and I believe it was Aaron Wherry who kind of noted that if you'd been playing a drinking game with Pierre Poilievre using that word, you would have been flat out on the floor. Mark Carney's Liberals, they technically have a majority in the House, and they use that to their advantage. Could it easily be wiped away in a few months based on floor crossings and by-elections? Sure thing, but they are going to put, pedal to the metal, and they are going to go for it. Obviously, it's not apples to apples, but I suppose you can't really fault the Conservatives for trying to do the same thing and saying, well, technically this is where we are, so we are going to use that to our political advantage. It was interesting, though, to see that, hear all these economists, including who you just had on, say this is really kind of like the wrong, not to put words in their mouth, but the sense that you're getting is that this is really the wrong tack to take. Nobody is in disagreement that the economy is weak and that it's sluggish, but hammering on the recession part of it is actually potentially doing more damage than good. And historically, under the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre Conservatives, they've been really good at finding those micro things, those cost of living, those individual. Are you better off under this government than you were before? So their AI ad that they put out over the last couple of days, and the GST rebate that Steph mentioned, those are kind of both sides of the same coin. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives trying to say, we understand to a degree that what matters is what money in your pocket, food on the table. But I don't know if either side is really going to make the correct argument or going to win over people who are concerned about that based on the individual tracks they're taking.
And Rob, I mean, the finance minister's point off the top there is right. There are lots of shifts happening inside the economy. That's what the government's trying to do right now. But as Francis Donald also said in that interview, it takes a long time for some of those things to happen. So I wonder how Canadians sort of cope with the immediate problems in the economy while waiting for other changes to take hold over time.
Yeah, and how they, put their mind to all the statistics. Like there's lies, damned lies, and statistics is the old line, right? And as your previous guest just noted, you can throw any statistic out about the economy. There's thousands of them and be used to weaponize that emotion that Stephanie was talking about, the feelings of fear or hope that politicians thrive on. I thought, the Prime Minister's pushback on the idea that his economic plan is just settling in. The data is going to be uneven. He pointed to, population declines due to immigration policies. I mean, boy, I don't know if he wants to open that door. It's a double-edged sword. The immigration policies, they have done good things in the housing market, I guess, lowering the price of rent, lowering the price of homes. They've also put people underwater on their mortgages. They've removed international students from post-secondary institutions. Like GDP per capita, when you're lowering the population due to immigration policies, starts you down a hill of political consequences and commentary that at some point, I guess the Prime Minister is going to have to talk about whether the immigration policy remains the same. So sure, throw out the statistics, but behind them is a decision by the government, and each one unravels in sort of consequences that the government can and can't control.
I talked to a woman earlier, it's going to be in the next hour in Newfoundland, who got the grocery premium on Friday. I think she got $500. She says that's going to last her family with 4 kids a week or two. And I thought, well, that's probably stretching things because things are expensive. So, Steph, does the government then have to think about other things it might be able to do in the coming months if things aren't, if these big changes in the economy aren't bringing Canadians any relief?
It's going to be an excellent question, right? I mean, Mr. Carney has already spent billions of extra dollars that some will argue, that the country doesn't have unless we're content and comfortable with pushing up the deficit and pushing up the debt. And Mr. Carney has promised to rein in government spending. He's promised to slash that sort of thing. And so I don't know at what point, they're making these one-off decisions, the grocery benefit being one of them. It costs several $1 billion, and that's paid for by debt and deficit. Is that sustainable for Canadians? Again, we go back to the political argument. Do Canadians, if you get, $500 today that's going to help feed your family for 2 weeks, are you okay with that if it means in a year there's less money for, roads in your community because the government's transfer payments for infrastructure have to go down, right? Do people make that calculus? I don't think they do.
No.
For Mr. Carney, it's going to be a math equation. And do people feel better off longer term? I don't know that the world right now is such that any benefit, any premium, any tax break is really going to make anybody feel any better.
Yeah, I mean, the gas tax break is a perfect example. That changed things for a weekend, and then you were back up to paying a high price again. Last word to you, Charelle, on this.
For right now, I do think that the Prime Minister has the runway at least to try. New numbers out from Abacus this morning saying that, he still holds a lead, especially amongst people for whom affordability and cost of living is their top issue. There has been, however, a switch. So there could be, some more competition, some room for the Conservatives to come through, because there are now more people than previously saying that the country's going in the wrong direction as opposed to the right direction. So there is some runway, but not a lot.
The U.S. is starting to get the issues on the table that they really want addressed in the CUSMA review. We're advancing the wider trade issues, including the 232s on auto, steel, aluminum. I think we're ready for a bumpy ride. It's always a bumpy ride with the Americans these days, but I think we've made our case in a number of areas.
Former Conservative Party leader and current member of the Canada-US Advisory Committee, Erin O'Toole, from our conversation last hour. Canadian representatives were in Washington this past week, and they struck an optimistic tone about trade negotiations, which haven't officially started, but at least they're talking, despite signals from both sides that CUSMA review deadline of July 1st will be blown past. Doesn't mean that the agreement is over, just means they continue working. So what does it mean for Canada's trade deal with the U.S.? Let's bring back our Sunday Scrum. Stephanie Levitz is a senior reporter in the Globe and Mail's Parliament Hill Bureau in Ottawa. Charelle, Evelyn, the managing editor of the Hill Times, also in Ottawa. And Victoria today, Rob Shaw, political correspondent for CHEK News. Rob, I said I'd start with you, and I keep my promises.
Oh, good.
After that conversation with Erin O'Toole and then a couple other people from the council that were speaking, and even from what the Prime Minister said, I thought there was maybe a little bit of a shift this week in terms of where things are going. I couldn't tell you where, but it did sound a little more optimistic. Tell me your perspective.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it is interesting that Dominic LeBlanc comes out and says things look, potentially optimistic here after his round of negotiations and his meeting with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer. But, immediately we get hit with the U.S. rope-a-dope, which is the 10%, new forced labor tariff. So it's a reminder, I think, that the United States says one thing in one room and then hits us with another thing on social media to keep Canada on the back foot. I will say that the reaction to the 10% new tariffs, I think, gives the Prime Minister breathing room. We don't see the public outrage or concern that we did 18 months ago with the first round of American tariffs. It's so complicated. People are struggling to understand what it means. The president keeps pivoting on tariffs. So in that sense, the Prime Minister doesn't face the same pressure to knee-jerk reaction or stand up or ban new things. But the vibe here, I hope the vibe is as good as Erin O'Toole says, that behind the scenes they're actually getting to the issues and the letters, and because overall it still looks like we're giving up ground to the Americans and we're not making any progress. And that's a risk for the Prime Minister, whose whole image is built around putting his elbows up and taking it to the Americans here.
Well, and to that point, Charelle, the Prime Minister was asked about the CRTC change that they've asked for when it comes to streaming giants, and said it was about affordability. I think, okay, but I think a lot of people think it's a lot more to do with the United States and a concession that may have been needed there.
Yeah, and that's, when the 10% tariff announcement came, the Prime Minister said, well, that's not a surprise. Neither was it a surprise that this might have been the way that the government went when it came to that CRTC order, simply because it has been identified as an irritant, quote unquote, for basically since the moment it was proposed and became law. So, as Rob said, giving something up, not necessarily the Canadian public, not necessarily seeing what we're getting for that. Yeah, that's where there is potential for issues for the government. I mean, at what point, essentially, everybody has to make that calculation. At what point do Canadians start to blame their own government for the actions of Donald Trump? Conservatives are hoping that it's be sooner rather than later. So they say, Mark Carney was elected and he had deadlines that he set, and then he with the express purpose of dealing with Donald Trump, and he's failed to meet them. But everybody who is in those rooms is coming out of those rooms saying, hey, things are maybe kind of rosy, but we all know that things are going to be bumpy and there's talk of turbulence and it's going to be a rough ride and it's unpredictable because that's just who you're dealing with.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart point there, Stephanie, that Charelle makes about you're trading things off, but we don't know what we're getting in return. Or are you just trading things off to get the conversation started, or because you don't want to further irritate them with something that you know is going to be problematic? It's like it's all quite obscure what's going on, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if this was a multiple choice question, it's select E for all of the above. And I think one of the challenges the Carney government has is the things that Canadians might view as concessions, Americans see as, well, we told you not to do that in the first place.
That's right.
Right. So Americans, on CRTC, on taxes on the online streaming companies, which are largely American, Americans had already pinpointed that as something, hey, don't do that. And then we did it. And so then if we walk it back, it's not really a concession, right, in that sense. And so the question becomes, what are the real concessions on the table? What are the things that Canada is prepared to give up? And what would America be willing to do in return? I think it's interesting, and albeit constantly frustrating, that you have Dominic LeBlanc, who by his very nature is a good times guy. I mean, when has Dominic LeBlanc been a sourpuss or sounded a warning note on anything? It's his nature to be positive and optimistic, and some of that's obviously political spin. But we get to a point where it would be so nice and refreshing to have some transparency from the Carney government about what that rocky ride might in fact look like. What are the things that Canada is thinking about? And nobody's asking to put all of their cards on the table. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think it's effective in terms of negotiations. But what are we really talking about here? And the challenge broader for Canadians as a whole is that we have CUSMA, and 85% of goods are still tariff-free, and that's fantastic. And then you have the 232 tariffs that are, the negotiations on those, that's steel, auto, those sectors, they're being lumped together when they're not quite the same thing in their own way, which is to say, are we is there anything in CUSMA, I guess I'd like to know from both sides, is there anything else in CUSMA that we're thinking about ditching? Yeah. What in there is at risk right now? And then what about the 232s? If we can get to a point, which I think maybe Canadians are at, that those tariffs are not going to go to zero. There is going to be some level of tariff because that's the United States' trade and foreign policy right now, and we're not going to get them to upend that. All this to say, a lot of mixed messaging, a lot of questions, and if there is a bumpy ride coming, maybe we're already on that bumpy ride. Are we getting off the ride, or are there just more bumps? The Carney government should talk a little bit more to Canadians about that.
Yeah, I mean, I joked with Aaron O'Toole for him to just tell me all the things that were in the American letter where they've sort of laid out what their concerns are. I'm pretty sure the four of us could put together what those concerns are if we put our heads together. But it would be nice to know what the U.S. is looking for. The Canadian officials say it's not their job to make that public. Okay, but Rob, I think Stephanie's right. These are all we don't really know what's going on.
Yeah, and I think Stephanie's right too, that are we giving up things that the Americans just are we trying to make concessions on the online streaming act to save the dairy sector? But in fact, the Americans don't view it that way. They just view it as you shouldn't have done that. I think that's a great point. But it gets confusing because out here, just to add to the other things that aren't actually related, the softwood lumber tariffs are the dominant issue in British Columbia, not even remotely related to the different paths of what we're talking about, predates all of this, and yet the Premier here is putting pressure on the Prime Minister to use that as a way into the deal. And then we start deluding ourselves in a way that somehow maybe this November timeline for midterms is going to put pressure on the President to show some progress, yet every time we've set one of those kind of deadlines in our mind, it fails to do anything. So we're completely in the dark here on what the negotiating position is, the timeline, and whether it gets bumpier. And that, I think, kind of builds a little bit of frustration and confusion over the government's strategy. Yeah.
Last 30 seconds or so to you, Charelle.
We know that the United States president likes drama. And we know that if this July 1st deadline is to indicate renewal, they may not do that, which would lead to, ongoing annual renewals until somebody maybe says, hey, 6 months from now, we're pulling out of this deal, or we're going to keep this going till 2036. Yeah. And until such a time as somebody and it would have to come from the U.S., somebody finally puts their foot down and says, no, we're going to stop this and we're going to do it one way or the other. I think that's kind of the ride that we're on. And so until such a point where either Donald Trump leaves office, or somebody, or the midterms happen, or somebody gets fed up and says, Congress, which have you, this has to end, I think we're going to be in for a ride for a while.
I was sort of optimistic when I started this conversation with the three of you, and now I'm not. So that's what journalists do to each other. Rob, Charelle, Evelyn, Stephanie Levitz, thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thanks for spending some time with us.